Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Although the London Underground is far from crime-free, murder on the network is, thankfully, extremely rare.
This is a Bakerloo line train to Harrow and Wheelstone.
Nevertheless, throughout its long history, numerous murders have indeed been committed on the Underground, a surprising number of which remain unsolved to this very day. In this video, we'll explore 10 such cases, a group of terrible crimes which occurred between the 1860s and the 1980s. As I'm sure you can appreciate, certain aspects of what we're about to see are rather grim, so viewer discretion is advised. The London Underground is the oldest system of its kind in the world, and it all began in January 1863 with the opening of the Metropolitan Railway, which in those days was powered by steam locomotives. Incredibly, the first unlawful killing associated with the London Underground occurred just under 2 weeks before its official opening. At around 9 AM on New Year's Eve 1862, a group of children made a dreadful discovery on Britannia Street, a quiet road overlooking a Metropolitan Railway cutting, which was originally designed as a spot where passing locomotives could vent steam, between King's Cross and Farringdon. What they found was, tragically, a dead baby boy, the infant having apparently been dumped in the ruins of a house that had been torn down to make way for the line. The children alerted a police constable, who took the poor soul to St Pancras Workhouse Infirmary, now St Pancras Hospital, where a fellow named Dr Saul determined the infant had only been 2 or 3 days old when he perished. On the 10th of January 1863, the very same day the Metropolitan Railway opened to the public, it was reported that an inquest held at the Wellington Tavern on University Street had come to the conclusion that the baby, having been placed naked on the ground near the arches of the Metropolitan Railway, had died from exposure to the cold, and so a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown was returned. The coroner, Dr Lancaster, used the inquest to call to attention the important subject of the great frequency of unpunished child murder. Apparently, such cases had become so commonplace, the police rarely bothered to investigate them. This sad incident was a symptom of the dreadful social conditions which existed during the Victorian-era, and unfortunately, there were at least 2 similar cases recorded on the Underground in the 19th century. In September 1866, for example, the body of another baby boy was found on the tracks between Aldersgate, now Barbican, and Moorgate. This child had suffered a fatal head injury before being wrapped in brown paper and then apparently thrown off of a bridge on Milton Street, an area now covered by the Barbican Centre. Then, in January 1881, a railway worker discovered another murdered infant in a tunnel near Gower Street, now Euston Square. It was believed in this case, the victim, who had been strangled, had been thrown out of a train as it departed the station. As with the Britannia Street incident, the verdict of willful murder against some person or persons at present unknown was returned in both of these cases. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, 2 high-profile figures were found dead within the tunnels of the London Underground, the circumstances of which, in each case, aroused great suspicion. The first incident, which occurred in October 1880, involved the death of Kirwan Percival Joyce, the grandson of Spencer Percival, who, to date, is the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated whilst in office. Joyce was found in the tunnel near Temple Station on the 7th of October, and as reported at the time, he'd been a victim of violence. Robbery was ruled out as a motive, for the victim had £20 on his person, roughly £2,000 in today's money, and friends who'd spent time with Joyce just hours before his death insisted that he'd been both sober and in good spirits. Joyce had a rather shady past though. As well as once being the head of the detective department in Bombay, he'd also worked for the Turkish government before moving to Abyssinia, where he'd, quote, offered to procure the capture of the king, provided the English government paid him a very large sum of money, a proposal that was politely refused. Bearing all of this in mind, it's safe to assume Joyce made a number of enemies in his time, but whether his checkered past had anything to do with his death was never established. The second mystery concerns Maude Frances Davis, an author and social campaigner who devoted her life to improving working conditions for the poor. In early 1913, Davis had travelled to New York, where it's believed she conducted investigations into human trafficking. On a return voyage, a friend who accompanied Davis claimed she became increasingly uneasy and was convinced she was being followed or spied upon. The pair docked in Liverpool on the 1st of February 1913 and took a train to Euston. Here, Maude Davis stored her luggage and purchased an underground ticket to High Street Kensington, where she intended to catch up with another group of friends. As such, she parted ways with her travel companion at Euston, marking the last known time Davis was seen alive. At 2 AM on the 2nd of February, a workman stumbled across her body in a tunnel just outside High Street Kensington. Davis had been struck by a passing train, the last of which would have left the station at around 12:45 AM. Although when a post-mortem was carried out, it was discovered she had been stabbed multiple times in the chest with a short, sharp object. Fragments of this implement, possibly a hat pin, were reportedly found within Maude Davis's heart. Blood was discovered in the station waiting room too, suggesting those injuries had not been inflicted in the tunnel. At an inquest into Maude Davis's death, the jury returned an open verdict. On the 7th of April 1915, The Times reported on a case which was said to be one of the most baffling to have occupied the London police for some time. The crime in question was the appalling murder of young Margaret Nally, which had occurred on Easter Sunday, her 7th birthday, in a coin-operated cubicle of the women's lavatories at Aldersgate Station, which, as seen earlier, has since been renamed Barbican. The child had been assaulted and suffocated. Blood found on her teeth suggested she'd desperately attempted to defend herself by biting her assailant. Margaret's body was found some distance from home. She'd lived on Amberley Road near Paddington, just under 5 miles from Aldersgate, and on the afternoon she was murdered, she'd spent time visiting relatives on Carlisle Street, now Penfold Street, and Richmond Street, now Orchardson Street, both of which are off of Edgware Road, and were places Margaret often walked to and from alone. Margaret was last seen alive at around 8 PM on Carlisle Street, when she told her younger cousin she was heading home. Warned by adults to never take the path along the Regent's and Grand Union canals, her route usually went via Clifton Road and Warwick Avenue, a walk which takes about 25 minutes. It would appear that, at some point along this journey, a stranger enticed Margaret to join them, taking her onto a train at either Edgware Road or Royal Oak, then onto Aldersgate, where the assault and murder took place. Being a quiet evening on an Easter Sunday, there were no confirmed sightings of the pair, and Margaret's body was discovered at the station at around midnight. That day, the child had been wearing a distinctive grey-blue felt-trimmed hat, which was missing when her body was discovered. Although a soldier claimed to have seen the item of clothing abandoned on a seat in the Grand Cinema on Edgware Road, no trace of either the hat or Margaret's killer were ever found. In the early autumn of 1954, life was looking good for Jean Townsend. Aged 21, she had a dream job working as a theatre costumier in London's West End, her workplace being on Irving Street near Leicester Square. On the 14th of September 1954, Jean attended a party on Piccadilly held for the cast of Guys and Dolls, which was running at the Coliseum Theatre. At around 10:45 PM, she headed home, taking the Central line from Oxford Circus to South Ruislip, where she lived on Bempton Drive with her parents. She was seen exiting the station at around 11:45 PM, but Jean never made the 20-minute walk home. She was found dead the following morning on a patch of grass on Victoria Road, a site now occupied by St Gregory the Great Church. Jean had been killed using her own scarf. There were no signs of a struggle or sexual assault, and her handbag was found a short distance away. Following the murder of Jean Townsend, several women came forward to describe similar recent attacks they'd experienced on and around the Underground. Doris Rennell, for example, had been grabbed outside North Harrow Station by an individual who'd been staring at her on the Metropolitan line all the way from Baker Street. Fortunately, Doris managed to fight her assailant off and described the man as having a distinctive high forehead. Another woman described a similar looking individual who she said spoke with an American accent. This led to suspicion that the attacker may have been an American serviceman based at US Air Force South Ruislip. There is a theory, however, that the man who murdered Jean Townsend may well have been the Scottish serial killer Peter Manuel, the so-called Beast of Birkenshaw. Manuel, who murdered at least 7 people, committed his crimes in Scotland and Northern England, although he is known to have spent time in Ruislip at around the time Jean was killed. The descriptions given of the mysterious man with the high forehead certainly resemble Manuel, and furthermore, as Manuel had spent part of his childhood in New York, he had a distinctive American twang to his accent. Peter Manuel was executed at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison in July 1958, and the murder of Jean Townsend remains unsolved. Born into a Polish noble family in 1884, Countess Łubieńska was a remarkable woman who endured great suffering in her life. A life that, in 1957, would come to a violent end on the Piccadilly line. Countess Łubieńska devoted much of her life to helping others, a role which began in 1906 when she joined the Polish Red Cross. In 1918, amid the turmoil surrounding the restoration of Polish independence, land was seized from the Łubieńska family, and Teresa's husband, Edward, was stabbed to death. Further tragedy occurred in September 1939, when Łubieńska's son, Stanislaw, an officer in the army, was killed in the Nazi invasion of Poland. Following the subsequent occupation of her country, the Countess quickly became a member of the Polish resistance, organising covert activities from her apartment in Warsaw. In 1942, though, she was betrayed to the authorities and, after interrogation, thrown into Auschwitz as a political prisoner, complete with a tattooed number, 44747. Although sentenced to death, Countess Łubieńska was spared thanks to an intervention by the Swedish Red Cross. She managed to survive the hell of the concentration camps and, following liberation, moved to a flat in London, on Cornwall Gardens in Kensington, where she worked tirelessly to help other former prisoners who'd been displaced. On the evening of Friday, the 24th of May 1957, Countess Łubieńska visited friends in Ealing. She then headed home, taking the Piccadilly line from Ealing Common to her local station, Gloucester Road. The train pulled in just before 10:20 PM, and a number of passengers alighted, although the Countess, being aged 73 and having led a tough life, was slow on her feet, and was supposedly alone on the platform as the tube departed. On duty at the station that night was ticket collector and lift operator Emmanuel Akinyemi. At around 10:20 p.m, he heard footsteps pounding up the emergency staircase, followed by a woman shouting, "Bandit!" As Emmanuel went to investigate, he saw Countess Łubieńska staggering towards the lift, clutching her chest. Although she could barely speak, she managed to gasp, "I've been knifed." The Countess was rushed to nearby St Mary Abbott's Hospital, her last words in the ambulance being, "I was on the platform, then stabbed." She died shortly after arrival. It transpired that Countess Łubieńska had been stabbed 5 times, 3 times in the chest, along with 2 more wounds to her stomach and back. The search for her murderer was extensive. Tube tracks were scoured, 214 Piccadilly line cars were examined, and in all, police spoke to 18,000 people. As none of her valuables had been seized, robbery was ruled out as a motive. This left 2 other theories. The first being that the Countess, who was a stickler for good manners, had reprimanded a group of youths for being too rowdy, a scolding they took umbrage to. Secondly, it was speculated her murder was some kind of spiteful retribution for the role she'd played during the war. The identity of Countess Teresa Łubieńska's murderer remains a mystery. She's buried in Brompton Cemetery. You can see her grave close to the old Brompton Road entrance. On the afternoon of August 3rd, 1983, 2 homeless men, Paul McManus and Kieran Patrick Kelly, were indulging in a boozing session on Clapham Common, during the course of which they drunkenly robbed a 65-year-old man of his watch and wedding ring. Fortunately, 2 policemen happened to be patrolling nearby. They arrested the 2 vagrants and hauled them off to Clapham Police Station. Here, both steaming drunk, they were placed in a cell along with another homeless alcoholic, 55-year-old William Boyd, who was fast asleep. Sometime later, Paul McManus was heard shouting and banging on the cell door, and when officers finally decided to check what the commotion was, they made a shocking discovery. William Boyd was dead, killed with a makeshift ligature that had been crudely fashioned from a pair of socks. Rather tellingly, Kieran Kelly was calmly sitting close by, with bare feet. Kelly confessed to the murder immediately, and by all accounts seemed rather pleased with his dire deed, stating that, "The dirty old bugger was snoring, he ain't gonna snore no more." Supposedly buoyed by the killing, Kieran Kelly began confessing to a slew of other murders. The first, he claimed, had occurred back in 1953, when he and a friend named Christy Smith had travelled over from Ireland to see the Queen's coronation. At some point, however, the 2 had gotten into an argument at Baker Street Station, whereupon Kelly pushed his pal beneath a tube train. Kelly claimed to have shoved numerous other victims beneath tube trains in the ensuing years, mainly those on the edge of society, such as himself, with whom he'd gotten into drunken disagreements. Although it sounds like a tall story, there's no doubt that Kieran Kelly was an extremely dangerous man, well known amongst London's homeless community for having a ferocious temper. There were indeed at least 2 documented instances of him shoving people under trains, both on the Northern Line. In 1977, he'd pushed Gordon McMurray, aka Jock Toland, beneath a train at Oval. Then in 1982, he'd done the same to Francis Taylor at Tooting Bec Station. In both of these cases, the men had survived by sheer fortune, tumbling into the trench between the tracks before the train could hit them, and although Kelly was arrested in both instances, nothing came of it. Back at Clapham Police Station in 1983, Kelly confessed to another murder, that of Hector Fisher, who was stabbed to death on Clapham Common in 1975. Sneering to detectives that, "I'm too clever for you, aren't I?" Kelly explained that, to avoid making the murder of Hector look like a robbery, he had left £20 on the victim's person. He was also able to accurately describe the locations of the stab wounds. These were details only the murderer would have been privy to, and as such, Kieran Kelly was given a life sentence at the Old Bailey in 1984 for both the murders of William Boyd and Hector Fisher. Kelly died at HMP Franklin in 2001, and the exact truth and potential number of victims he may well have killed on the tube between the mid-1950s and early 1980s remains a mystery. In the 1980s, two separate, unsolved murders occurred at two London tube stations, both of which were shocking in their swiftness and brutality. The first incident occurred at Balham Station on the afternoon of Saturday the 5th of March 1983, when tube worker Gilbert Barrett was shot dead at point-blank range through the window of a ticketing booth. The station was quiet at the time, and Gilbert's body wasn't immediately discovered, giving the perpetrator time to flee. It's believed 54-year-old Gilbert, who was a widower, had refused to hand over cash when it was demanded. Whoever killed him got away with £150, about £500 in today's money. Despite London Transport offering a £2,000 reward for any information, police drew a blank. The murder weapon was never found, nor indeed was the individual who'd so callously pulled the trigger. The second senseless killing occurred on Saturday the 4th of October 1986, when 19-year-old Terry Burns was stabbed to death by a gang in the entrance to Embankment Station. That afternoon, Terry had been visiting London with an unnamed friend. They had a drink inside St Martin's Tavern, now at Theodore Bullfrog, on John Adams Street, and upon stepping outside, the pair were confronted by a gang of around 12 young men, all of who appeared to be Millwall fans. After verbal threats were traded, Terry and his mate were physically attacked. Both men were stabbed, and Terry was chased along Villiers Street towards Embankment Station, where he was again set upon, this time fatally. Although 6 men were arrested and put on trial at the Old Bailey in December 1987 for Terry's murder, Judge Robert Limbury directed the jury to return verdicts of not guilty on the murder charges, stating that none of the witnesses called had actually seen the fatal stabbing. As such, no one was ever brought to justice for Terry's murder. Our last case is, in my opinion, one of the Underground's most haunting mysteries. The Allens were a working-class family from Islington. In 1976, however, the head of the family, Thomas Allen, gained employment as a chauffeur for the Australian High Commission, a prestigious role which came with a cottage on Reston Place, Kensington. Thomas's son Martin attended the Central Foundation Boys' School in the borough of Islington, and often caught the tube to and from there, taking the Circle line from Gloucester Road, then changing at King's Cross St Pancras for the Northern line to Old Street. On bonfire night, the 5th of November 1979, Martin, then aged 15, left school with his friend Ian Fletcher just after 3 p.m. The pair travelled to King's Cross together, where they parted ways. That evening, rather than heading straight home, Martin intended to visit his older brother and sister-in-law at their home in Holloway, and so made his way to the Piccadilly line. Martin never made it to Holloway though, nor did he return to Reston Place. He'd vanished without a trace. Following appeals, a number of witnesses came forward to say they'd seen Martin, who'd been carrying a distinctive yellow bag, on the southbound Piccadilly line, with a man who'd kept his arm around the teenager. This individual was described as white, 6 foot tall, with blonde hair and a moustache, and wearing a blue denim jacket with a shirt and tie. It was said he was well spoken, and alarmingly, As the pair disembarked at Earl's Court Station, several people overheard him warning Martin, who was visibly nervous, "Don't try to run." The sighting at Earl's Court Station marked the last known time Martin Allen was seen. No trace of him was ever found, and as the years wore on, his elderly parents became convinced that their son had been murdered. It's widely believed the disappearance of Martin Allen has a potential link with the murder of 8-year-old Vishal Mehrotra, who went missing a few years later on the 29th of July 1981, the day of the royal wedding. That day, the Mehrotras travelled into London from East Putney Station to watch the grand occasion. After returning to Putney, Vishal went shopping for sweets with his younger sister and nanny, who then allowed him to walk back home alone. The last known sighting of Vishal, whose remains were found at an isolated farm in Sussex in early 1982, was on Putney High Street, although one witness, who has since passed away, claimed to have seen the young boy in the company of a strange man on a District Line train. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out on any future videos. Plus of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. And if you enjoyed this film, you can also give it a little boost by clicking the YouTube hype button below. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.